Today we're going to talk about what labor unions actually do. So, a labor union is an organized association of workers formed to protect their own interests and further their own rights. They, uh, uh, they work together to accomplish the things in the workplace that they want to accomplish. So that's a nice definition of labor unions, but what do they actually do? What does that look like? So if you Google what do labor unions do, what you end up finding is mostly economic research about the effects of labor unions, the effects of labor union policies. So right to work on unemployment and labor unions on wages and tax dollars and budget deficits and things like that. It's more about what do labor unions do uh, broadly, not like what do they actually do in practice. So I wanted to take this time to discuss what do labor unions do. Typically, when we think of labor unions, we think about wages and benefits. So labor unions negotiate for better wages and better benefits for their group, their workers, the workers within the association. But it's actually a lot more than that. That's the nuts and bolts of it. But there's also the chance for labor unions also give workers the chance for some kind of voice in uh, the operation of the workplace. So shared governance. Teachers can use their labor union, to negotiate smaller class sizes, to uh, uh, to try and protect their curriculum development time, and and so it's also about procedures. It's about um, what kind of grievances get filed, what kind of process goes through if a worker has been found to do something wrong. It's about providing some level of protection for that worker who might be in some kind of trouble with the employer. So it's about more. It's about process and shared governance and making decisions together with the employer, in addition to negotiating better wages and better working conditions and better retirements and things like that. More of the economic nuts and bolts things that we think about when we think of labor unions. Growing up, while I was growing up, my father was very active in his labor union. He's a public school custodian, and up until recently, he was the president of the labor union and sat on the negotiating team. And so uh, I saw an interesting dynamic as his family member when he'd come home and talk about labor union issues. It certainly was not all sunshine and rainbows. There were times when he'd talk about what was going on at work and negotiations and negotiating a new contract, and certainly there were times that he personally didn't believe that what his fellow workers wanted was actually right, or that that's really what should be done. But the labor union defends the contract. So it wasn't his job to decide whether something is right or wrong. It's his job as the head of the labor union to advocate for his workers, to advocate for his people, and so that's the mechanism that labor unions that's the mechanism of labor unions. So a lot of times people in the in the media, in the public, will get upset when say a police officer has found to do something questionable or very, very blatantly wrong, right? Shoot an unarmed citizen, for example. one of the criticisms of the police officers' labor union will be, well, look, they sent representation to defend this person who clearly shot someone dead in the street, and now they're defending this cop, this crooked cop. The job of the labor union is not to be, and their legal representation is not to be a moral compass. It's to defend their workers and assure that there's a fair process prior to sanctions or termination. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the people within the labor union have always done something right, but that they deserve some level of due process. So some of the things that labor unions do, some of the labor union activities, well, they organize their members. A lot of labor unions, much like social clubs, if you're a part of a social club, you know that membership is a huge issue. So you can't have a whole lot of power if you don't have members. So much of what labor unions do is membership drives and trying to organize their members and approaching the people in the workplace and saying, look, if you're a member of our union, these are the benefits that it has being a member. This is how we're working to help you as an employee here at Enter Place of Employment. So they spend a lot of time trying to build membership and organize membership and educate them about what legislative policies affect them, about what they want in the workplace, collecting information from the workers about what they want so that the union can represent them accurately. Relatedly, they lobby legislatures for policies that would be beneficial to workers. So some of the organizing of the employees would involve organizing protests or letter writing campaigns or telling them that they need to call their state representative and stop a bill or pass a bill or whatever it might be that is seen as either beneficial or detrimental to workers. So there's a legislative activity involved too. Then a lot of times what people think about when they think about labor unions are strikes. So personally, I'm of the mindset that when you've gotten to a point of striking, then that's actually that's not the goal of the labor union. That's what happens when things break down, when communication breaks down, when negotiations aren't being done in good faith, and when they're seen as no other real option. But some people would argue that labor unions favor more strikes. If there are labor unions, there are more strikes. There's a lot of evidence that shows that the labor union doesn't lead to strikes. Strikes lead to labor unions. But anyway, you have different types of strikes. So we've seen strikes recently in West Virginia and Colorado and Oklahoma from teacher strikes, which we'll be getting to in a later video. A strike is a work stoppage. So when workers decide that their demands are not being met, that they're not being bargained with in good faith, or they're not being negotiated with, they're not being met halfway, they're being unjustly treated over working conditions, wages, whatever the breaking point item on the agenda might be, they call a work stoppage. So they just don't come into work. And if enough of them do it all together, then it's very hard for the employer to then fire them. If I don't show up to work, you can presume that I'm going to be fired ultimately. If one person doesn't show up, then they get fired. But if the whole factory or if the whole school doesn't show up, it becomes very difficult for say, the governor of West Virginia to just fire every public school teacher in the entire state because they didn't show up to work. So you have a strength in numbers that comes with labor unions, and so strikes are one of the most powerful tools the labor union can have to disrupt the workplace and ultimately try to win what they want. But there are different types of strikes. So there are slowdowns. So some employees don't have the right to strike, and maybe state legislation has written that there are stiff penalties for striking, that it would be very hard to win in court over this strike dispute, and so it's particularly dangerous for them to strike and try and keep their jobs. So instead of actually not showing up to work, workers on factory lines would slow down. They just wouldn't operate the machinery as fast as they usually do. Obviously, something like a slowdown is not quite possible. How do you slow down the school day? There are certain professions where a slowdown doesn't really work. But the typical factory setting, you can actually slow down how many widgets you're making in an hour. Another common type of strike that is not called a strike, it's kind of a strike, is the sick out. So, especially in states where certain sections of the labor force are not allowed to strike, you have sick outs where everybody just calls in sick, or at least a very large portion of the staff call in sick. Occasionally, you'll see this with police officers who, in the vast majority of states in the United States, do not have the right to strike. Sometimes they'll have sick outs instead. So a whole bunch of police officers all at once will call in sick. And it becomes very hard to, although we know what's going on, it becomes very hard to prove that they weren't sick. So you have sick outs. A lot of teachers called in sick. There was a sick out in Wisconsin when Wisconsin Act 10 was being passed. This was a collective bargaining reform in 2011 that gutted collective bargaining for public employees, and teachers called in sick to go protest at the state house. There was a sick out, and doctors actually wrote notes outside the state house, sick notes, to excuse them from work, saying, yes, they do have a bad cough that day. Again, hard to prove. There's hard to prove that somebody wasn't sick, hard to prove that somebody with documentation was faking it, if they have a note from a doctor or whatever, even though the whole state of Wisconsin knew people are calling in sick because they're going to protest. So the sick outs were massive at that time, and they're a tool for striking workers. One other one I want to touch on, one other type. So what usually happens is if you're a member of a labor union, you have labor representation in the workplace. You don't the workers themselves don't directly vote to strike. They kind of do. So let me explain. The labor union would come together. They'd have a vote. They'd have a strike authorization vote. And what they would be voting on is they're voting whether to give their leadership, the labor union president and vice president and the representative from whatever labor association is in negotiations with them, give them the power to say, we're striking, we're calling a strike. And that way, if negotiations break down, they have that in their back pocket. They go, look, I've already got the support of my membership to call a strike. I can do it right now myself, because this is not going well, and negotiations are turning south, and I've been authorized to call a strike if I want to. I got the support of the membership. You don't have to go have a separate vote for that if negotiations break down. So the workers will call a strike authorization vote, and they will, if they vote in favor of it, they'll authorize the union to call a strike if negotiations break down. If there's a type of strike that is not authorized by the union, so when you have a strike where there is no support from the union, so say teachers at a local school want to go on strike, but their representatives in their union, the wing of the National Education Association, depending on whatever state you're in, if their organization with the National Education Association, if their union representative says this is a bad idea, we should not strike. Like, negotiations are going okay. This is not the next step we want to have. But the workers decide we're going to strike anyway. If they decide we're not showing up to work and it's not authorized by their union representation, that's called a wildcat strike. A wildcat strike. So when the workers go on strike without any authorization from union leadership. So now let's talk about what happens. We've talked a little bit about what labor unions are and what we typically think about with labor unions and different types of strikes and organizing their members and the activities that unions partake in. Let's talk about collective bargaining. So in some states, unions have the right to collectively bargain. The collective bargaining is the negotiation process. It's you're bargaining collectively for a contract. So in states with labor union contracts and strong collective bargaining rights, the employer has to bargain in good faith. There's a meet and confer clause or a duty to bargain clause that says that the employer has to bargain in good faith, meet at reasonable times, and exchange proposals to then adopt a new contract. So in some states that doesn't exist so much. So you'll notice that a lot of the striking teachers are in states without collective bargaining rights. The teachers in West Virginia didn't have the option to go to the table and negotiate better wages because they don't have collective bargaining rights. Same with the teachers in Oklahoma. So then they have to rely on organizing their members, lobbying the state legislature, holding demonstrations, and then ultimately the strike. In states with stronger unions, they have a legal right to a seat at the table. So if a group of workers votes, if a group of employees votes to unionize, they would choose their representation, their union representation. They would establish a negotiating team. So this would usually be the president, vice president of your labor union, plus a labor representative from the parent labor union. So if your labor union is part of the AFL-CIO, then you have an AFL-CIO representative. If your labor union is if you're in a teachers union and your labor union is part of the National Education Association, somebody from the National Education Association or the state organization of the National Education Association. So the Ohio Education Association, the Oklahoma Education Association, whatever they call them, the New York Education Association. I'm not sure. Some have different names or whatever. But if they're a wing of the National Education Association, then somebody from that organization is your labor representative. So that would be the negotiating team. Somebody from the representing labor union, and then the president of the labor union, one of the workers in that place of employment, the vice president of that labor union, and you establish this negotiating team. Then from there, if you're a newly formed union with collective bargaining rights, negotiating a contract, you have to figure out what your priorities are, and you have to start from scratch. If you are negotiating a new contract, then you need to analyze the experience that you've had under the current contract. You need to have figured out some idea of what you want in the next contract. So this usually, for a president of a labor union, wouldn't be really hard, because you know what kind of grievances have come up and what kind of issues in the workplace have come up over the last year, 2 years, 3 years, however long the contract has been. And so usually your negotiating team would walk into negotiations with an idea that, hey, we have teachers that are really, really upset about the new dress code. We have custodians and bus drivers who hate the fact that our contract says we have to wear uniforms. These are things we want to get rid of, or these are things we want to change. So you have to figure out, what do you like and not like about the current contract and how it's actually worked out. You have to analyze the wages and benefits in the contract, and analyze the data, what the wages and benefits and increases have been compared to other people in similar jurisdictions or similar professions. So what are the bus drivers in your county making compared to the bus drivers in a similar county? What's the custodial staff making? What are the teachers making? The firefighters and police officers. Your members of your labor union would be analyzing what other school districts are doing, what other police departments are doing, and or in my case, what are other professors getting paid? What are their benefits like? You would be looking for that kind of data to figure out where your wages and benefits stand compared to other people with your qualifications. You would also be analyzing the legal developments, the relevant agreements, and the laws, policy changes that have happened. So, for example, recently the Supreme Court ruled in Janus v. Ask Me that fair share fees or agency fees could not be taken out automatically by the employer to help fund the operations of the labor union. They ruled that that's a violation of free speech, freedom of association. So because of that, if the previous contract had a clause that said that all of the employees would have agency fees taken out of their paychecks every year to pay for the negotiations and the operations of the collective bargaining team and the labor union, then that's compulsory collection of the agency fees, and you can no longer do that. And because that legal environment has changed, there's nothing to negotiate there. They have to take that out. It can't be done. There might be other things related to it that can be negotiated, but the legal environment has changed, and you now have something that's illegal in your contract. So the labor union, the workers have to know how the legal environment has changed. And management does this too. So management would analyze what the legal environment is. They would analyze what the budget is like at the school or the police department or whatever we're talking about, the factory. They also do a lot of the same stuff on their end to build their best case. So then you have to prioritize demands. What's important to the workers? classroom size, how we decide which bus routes the bus drivers have to drive, who gets priority in the bus routes, where teachers' aides, which buildings they work, and which students they're assigned to, custodial staff shifts, who's on first shift, who's on second shift, who's on third shift. Are those types of things more important, or are we really upset about our pay raises and health benefits? Health benefits tend to be, especially in today's world, very, very contentious because the cost of healthcare is going up. The premiums are going up. The cost of healthcare for the worker and for the employer are going up. So that has become a big sticking point in negotiations for a lot of labor unions. So you have to figure out what your priority is. Negotiating clearly, I'll choose an absurd example, but if one of the things in the contract is that the maintenance men get to buy steel toe boots on the school's dime for the local public school once a year at $150, and the administration wants to make it once every 3 years they get a new pair of steel toe boots. That's probably not a reason to go on strike. That's probably low on the list of priorities. That's something that you can negotiate away. That you can go, okay, we'll give you that, but we no longer want to have to wear certain uniforms, or we can give up that. Here's where our real sticking points are. So obviously, how much you're contributing to healthcare matters. How much you're contributing to your pension or your retirement. How much you're contributing to your healthcare costs. What's being deducted out of your paycheck. Your wages are more important than some of these smaller things. So you have to figure out what your priorities are. What are we're not budging on these things that must be changed, and we're willing to negotiate on these other things that just aren't working for either party. So then you have to arrange joint conferences with management or school administration, or the police administration or city management, whoever the employers are, the administration or management. You have to arrange conferences with them, decide a schedule for when to meet and when to negotiate, and deadlines for when certain things need to be done. And you need to make a formal presentation of your written proposals and demands. Both sides have to come to meet. The negotiating team and the administration have to get together, and they have to formally present, here's what we want in the next contract. This is our proposal. Now those in practice, the first set of proposals, usually pretty far apart. The labor union, the workers might come to management and say, okay, we're going big, going home. We're gonna do 5%, 5%, 5% for the next 3 years, and we don't pay a dime more in education or in health insurance. And the administration is going to go, there's no way we're doing 5%, 5%, 5%. Our proposal is that you get a 0% raise for the next 3 years, and you pay 10% more in your health insurance. And both sides are very, very far apart, and then they have to hammer out the details, figure out where their common ground is, what they can negotiate on, how they can change the process, how what's worked in the past, what hasn't worked, and then get to, of course, the nuts and bolts of, okay, what kind of raise, if any, what kind of bonus, what kind of changes can be made to come to an agreement. These things, of course, sometimes go more smoothly than others. Sometimes things get really ugly. Sometimes they go a little more smoothly. Depends on the circumstances. You have to set an agenda for what's going to be discussed first. What's going to be discussed first in the contract, and then you have to conduct negotiations. You have to start deciding what can you budge on, what can you compromise on, and what won't you compromise on. And both sides have to eventually come to some kind of agreement on each item in the contract. Finally, you have to draft and sign a written agreement ultimately, and the negotiating team, once they've come to an agreement with management, they have to take the union contract back to their workers and to hold a meeting or have some kind of mechanism to vote. And all of the workers in the labor union, and actually even if they didn't join the labor union, anyone that's going to be represented by the contract working at the place of employment, they have to vote. They have the choice. They don't really have to vote, but they are going to be asked to vote on the contract. And if the contract passes, then it's signed, and it becomes the next contract that the workers and management operate under for the next how many ever years the contract is written for. If the workers vote no, and oftentimes your union leadership are wise enough to know when they're bringing a contract back that won't get voted on. Like, try not to bring a contract. The union leadership doesn't want to bring a contract to the workers that is then going to get voted no on. That's something that they would avoid in most cases. So you bring the contract back to the workers, they vote yes on it, and then it becomes the contract. If they vote no, then you have to go back. You have to go back to the negotiating table and hammer something else out and continue from there. After that, depending on the place of employment, there are some cases, of course, with public employment where the agreement actually has to be approved by a state legislature or some kind of elected body. So that's really then okay. Of course, that's the negotiating process. That's the actual collective bargaining. After that, both sides have to then live up to the standards of the agreement. So the workers have to hold up their end of the bargain, that if they're going to do X, Y, and Z according to the contract, if that's what it says, they have to do that. And if they don't, then they can face punishment. If management is then violating the contract, then complaints can be made and grievances can be filed. And then there's a procedure for coming to some type of resolution, whether it be mediation or arbitration, some kind of process for disciplining the workers if they're not following the contract, and some kind of process for correcting issues if management isn't following the contract. The idea usually is that nobody gets everything they want, that management and labor have to negotiate things that they don't. That in a perfect world where they got to pick everything, they wouldn't have to do X, Y, and Z. They would just get to do A, B, and C. But they've agreed to do A, B, and C because management has said, okay, we'll let you do X, Y, Z. So, all right, and I think that's enough on what labor unions actually do. Thank you for watching.